At 6:15 a.m. on July 30th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth climbed into the tail gunner position of B-17 Tondelayo at Royal Air Force Kimbolton, watching a grey English dawn that would carry him 500 miles into Germany. He was 24 years old, had flown 12 combat missions, and had 3 confirmed kills. The Luftwaffe had positioned more than 300 fighters along the route to the target. Arooth lowered himself onto the narrow bicycle-style seat that served as his entire workstation. The tail gunner compartment measured roughly 4 feet wide and 5 feet long. 2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns pointed backward through a curved plexiglass window. At 25,000 feet, the outside temperature would plunge to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. His electrically heated suit was the only barrier between survival and death from hypothermia. The 8th Air Force called it the loneliest job in the war. The tail gunner worked alone, separated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. There was no one to talk to, no one to help if something failed, just one man, 2 guns, and whatever the Luftwaffe sent toward him. The numbers told the truth. In the summer of 1943, the average B-17 crew survived only 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners died faster than anyone except ball turret gunners. German fighter pilots preferred attacking from the rear. The tail position absorbed the first bullets. By July, the 379th Bombardment Group had already lost 9 aircraft in just 2 months of operations. 90 men were gone. The problem came down to geometry. German pilots understood that an approach from behind gave them the longest possible firing window. A Messerschmitt Bf 109, closing at 350 miles per hour from the 6 o'clock position, had nearly 10 seconds to aim and fire before passing the bomber. The tail gunner had those same 10 seconds to hit a target moving at combined speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. Most tail gunners never got that chance. The Focke-Wulf 190 carried 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. A single burst could shatter the plexiglass bubble, kill the gunner, and disable the tail controls. Bombers without tail protection became easy prey. The fighters would circle back, line up again, and finish the job. Standard Army Air Force's gunnery training taught gunners to wait, conserve ammunition, and fire only at ranges under 300 yards. The theory sounded reasonable in a classroom. In combat, 300 yards meant the enemy was already shooting. By the time a tail gunner pulled the trigger, he might already be dead. Arooth had seen it happen. On his 6th mission, a B-17 flying off Tondelayo's right wing took a direct hit to the tail section. The gunner never fired a single shot. The fighter came in fast with guns blazing, and the first rounds punched through the plexiglass before the American could react. The bomber dropped out of formation, trailing smoke. 8 parachutes appeared. The tail gunner was not one of them. Official doctrine demanded patience. Arooth questioned all of it. The fighters attacked from maximum range because they knew American gunners would hold their fire. Luftwaffe pilots had learned the patterns. They exploited the training manual like a roadmap. If you want to see how Arooth challenged the doctrine that was getting tail gunners killed, please tap the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Subscribe if you have not already. Back to Arooth. 186 B-17 bombers lifted off from bases across eastern England that morning. 123 P-47 Thunderbolts would escort them part of the way, but fuel limits meant the fighters would turn back over Belgium. The bombers would fly the final 200 miles to the target alone. Arooth checked his ammunition belts, 400 rounds per gun, 800 rounds total. The manual said that was enough for a standard mission. Arooth had already decided the manual was wrong about everything else. By noon, he would learn whether he was right. The cost of being wrong was a closed casket funeral and a telegram sent to his family. The formation crossed the English Channel at 14,000 feet. Still climbing, Arooth watched the water fall away through his plexiglass window, the white cliffs of Dover shrinking into a thin, pale line on the horizon. Ahead lay occupied France, then Belgium, then the heart of Nazi Germany. The P-47 escorts held position around the bomber stream. Their presence meant safety, but Arooth understood the math. The Thunderbolts carried enough fuel for roughly 90 minutes of combat flight. The mission to the target would take 6 hours. For most of the journey, the bombers would fly alone. Arooth had spent his first missions following doctrine. Wait for the fighter to close. Aim carefully. Fire in short bursts. Conserve ammunition. The gunnery instructors had drilled it into every student. Ammunition was limited. Accuracy mattered more than volume. A disciplined gunner could make 800 rounds last an entire mission. The doctrine assumed the enemy would cooperate. The Luftwaffe did not. German pilots had studied American tactics. They knew gunners waited until 300 yards, so they opened fire at 600 yards, pouring cannon shells into bomber formations while Americans held their triggers. By the time the tail gunners returned fire, the damage was already done. Arooth had calculated the problem differently. A Focke-Wulf 190 at 600 yards was not a difficult target. It flew straight toward him, nose pointed directly at his position, presenting the largest possible silhouette. The closing speed meant the apparent size doubled every few seconds. A gunner who fired early could walk his tracers onto the target, adjusting aim as the range closed. The risk was ammunition. 800 rounds sounded generous until divided by the number of attackers. A mission could bring 15, 20, even 30 separate attacks. At 50 rounds per burst, the math became unforgiving. A gunner who fired early could run dry before the mission ended. Arooth accepted the trade. A gunner who conserved ammunition but died on the third attack had made a terrible bargain. Survival required disrupting the enemy attack before it succeeded. If that meant running low on bullets, he would face that problem later. Dead men had no use for spare ammunition. His first test came on his fourth mission, a raid against submarine pens at St. Nazaire in June. A pair of Bf-109s approached from the 6 o'clock low position. It was the classic tail attack. Standard doctrine said to wait. Arooth opened fire at 700 yards. The tracers arced across the sky, falling short at first, then climbing toward the lead fighter. The German pilot saw the fire and broke off the attack, diving away before reaching effective cannon range. His wingman followed. Neither fighter scored a hit on Tondelayo. The crew chief questioned Arooth after landing. The ammunition count showed he had spent nearly 200 rounds in a single engagement. At that rate, he would run out before reaching targets deep inside Germany. Arooth explained his reasoning. The crew chief remained unconvinced. Other tail gunners heard about the incident. Some called it reckless. Wasting ammunition on long-range shots violated everything the Army Air Forces taught. The training manuals existed for a reason. Arooth was gambling with his crew's lives, but Tondelayo kept coming home. Mission after mission, the bomber returned to Kimbolton with its crew intact. Other aircraft in the squadron were not so lucky. By mid-July, 3 bombers from the unit had been lost. 30 men were gone. Now crossing into Belgium on July 30th, Arooth watched the P-47 escorts waggle their wings and turn back toward England. Fuel gauges in the Thunderbolts forced the retreat. The bombers pressed on alone. Somewhere ahead, 300 German fighters waited. Arooth would need every round he carried. He would also need to survive long enough to fire them. The first enemy formations appeared at 11:42 a.m., climbing from the southeast in groups of 4. Arooth counted 8, then 12, then stopped counting. The sky behind Tondelayo filled with black crosses on yellow noses. The lead fighter began its attack from the 6 o'clock high position, diving toward the bomber stream at 400 miles per hour. Arooth tracked the aircraft through his gun sight, watching the wingspan grow larger with every passing second. At 800 yards, he squeezed both triggers. The twin Brownings thundered to life, throwing a stream of tracers across the sky. The first rounds fell short, vanishing into empty air beneath the diving fighter. Arooth corrected his aim, walking the fire upward. At 600 yards, the tracers began to connect. Bright flashes erupted along the Messerschmitts' engine cowling. The German pilot broke hard to the right, smoke trailing behind his aircraft. He never completed his firing pass. The fighter spiraled downward and disappeared into the cloud layer below. Arooth had no time to watch. The second attacker was already closing in. This one approached lower, trying to slip beneath Arooth's field of fire. The angle was difficult, forcing him to depress his guns nearly to their mechanical limit. He fired anyway, sending a long burst toward the approaching fighter. The Focke-Wulf pilot flinched, pulling up early and releasing his cannon shells into empty sky above Tondelayo. The attacks continued for 47 minutes. Wave after wave of German fighters slashed through the bomber formation, targeting stragglers and damaged aircraft. Arooth fired at everything that entered his range, burning ammunition at 3 times the recommended rate. His gun barrels glowed red from sustained fire. At 12:29 p.m., a Bf-109 approached directly from astern, flying straight and level. The pilot showed either extraordinary courage or terrible judgment. Arooth centered the fighter in his gun sight and held both triggers down. The Brownings hammered for 6 continuous seconds, pouring more than 100 rounds into the oncoming aircraft. The Messerschmitt disintegrated. The engines tore free from the fuselage. The wings folded backward. What remained of the fighter tumbled past Tondelayo, close enough for Arooth to see the empty cockpit. The pilot had either ejected or died at the controls. 2 confirmed kills. Ammunition reduced to 180 rounds. The formation reached Kassel at 12:51 p.m. and began the bombing run. For 11 minutes, the bombers flew straight and level, unable to maneuver while the bombardiers aligned their targets. The Luftwaffe understood this moment meant maximum vulnerability. The fighters renewed their attacks with furious intensity. A Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tondelayo from the 5 o'clock position. Arooth swung his guns to meet it and fired a short burst. The rounds struck the fighter's wing root. The pilot kept coming, cannon shells ripping through Tondelayo's tail section. Arooth felt the impacts before he felt the pain. 20-millimeter fragments tore through the plexiglass, shredding his flight suit and burying themselves in his left arm and shoulder. His left gun jammed. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the compartment. He kept firing with the right gun. One-handed and bleeding, he tracked the wounded Focke-Wulf as it pulled away. A final burst caught the fighter's tail assembly. The aircraft snap rolled and plunged toward the ground, his third kill of the mission. The intercom crackled with voices from the crew. Someone asked about damage, someone else reported flak ahead. Arooth tried to answer, but his throat had gone dry. Blood pooled on the floor of his compartment, freezing almost instantly in the sub-zero air. 400 rounds expended, 63 remaining, 3 German fighters destroyed, and the mission was only half finished. Tondelayo still had to fly 250 miles back to England through the same gauntlet that had nearly killed him on the way in. Arooth wrapped a scarf around his wounded arm and waited for the next attack. The return flight began at 1:04 p.m. Tondelayo turned west with 185 other bombers, leaving Kassel burning beneath a column of black smoke. Arooth stayed at his position, scanning the sky through blood-smeared plexiglass. The Luftwaffe was not finished. German fighters regrouped over Belgium, positioning themselves along the bomber stream's route to the English Channel. Fresh aircraft replaced those lost or damaged earlier in the day. The second gauntlet would be just as dangerous as the first. Arooth's left arm had gone numb from cold and injury. His jammed gun remained useless. The feed mechanism had been shattered by the same cannon shell that wounded him. He had one working weapon and 63 rounds of ammunition to cover 250 miles of hostile airspace. The math demanded a new approach. With 63 rounds, he could afford perhaps 3 engagements of 20 rounds each. Every trigger pull had to matter. The luxury of suppressive fire was gone. At 1:31 p.m., a pair of Bf-109s closed in from the 7 o'clock position. Arooth waited until 500 yards, then fired a precise 12-round burst at the lead fighter. The tracers struck the engine cowling. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove away, trailing coolant. The wingman broke off without attacking. 51 rounds remained. Tondelayo crossed into France at 2:15 p.m. Fighter attacks faded as the Luftwaffe reached the limits of their operational range. By 2:47 p.m., the bomber formation had outrun the last German interceptors. The English Channel appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later. The landing at Kimbolton came at 3:52 p.m. Arooth could not climb out of his compartment without help. Ground crew pulled him through the narrow hatch and carried him to a waiting ambulance. The flight surgeon counted 11 separate fragment wounds in his arm, shoulder, and upper back. Word spread through the 379th Bombardment Group. Within hours, the tail gunner on Tondelayo was credited with 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables while wounded, operating a single gun with 63 rounds of ammunition. The mission intelligence report noted his early engagement technique as a factor in the bomber's survival. Other tail gunners began asking questions. Standard doctrine said to wait until 300 yards. Arooth had opened fire at 800. Doctrine said conserve ammunition. Arooth had burned through 700 rounds before being hit. Doctrine produced dead gunners. Arooth was still alive. The squadron gunnery officer reviewed the combat footage from Tondelayo's mission. Gun camera film showed Arooth's tracers reaching far beyond normal engagement ranges, disrupting attacks before German pilots could stabilize their aim. Early fire forced enemy aircraft to maneuver, degrading accuracy and reducing hits on the bombers. By mid-August, 3 other tail gunners in the squadron adopted variations of Arooth's method. Their survival rates improved. The bombers they protected returned with less damage. The correlation was impossible to ignore. The group commander received a preliminary report on September 1st. The data suggested aggressive early fire reduced bomber losses by disrupting coordinated fighter attacks. The findings challenged 2 years of established gunnery doctrine. Meanwhile, Arooth recovered from his wounds at the station hospital. Fragment damage had missed major blood vessels and nerves. The flight surgeon cleared him for duty on August 19th, 3 weeks after the Kassel mission. Tondelayo had a replacement aircraft waiting. The original bomber had been written off due to excessive battle damage. The new aircraft carried the same name and the same crew. Arooth climbed back into the tail position on August 26. The Luftwaffe noticed something changing in American bomber formations. Their intelligence officers began studying the problem. By early September, the pattern became clear. American tail gunners were opening fire earlier, sometimes at ranges beyond 600 yards. The shift disrupted attack formations that had worked reliably for months. German fighter pilots reported the change during debriefings across occupied Europe. The 6 o'clock approach, once the safest angle against B-17 formations, was becoming increasingly dangerous. Tracers reached out before pilots could establish stable firing platforms. The psychological impact was severe. Pilots seeing tracers streaming toward them at long range instinctively maneuvered, even when rounds fell short. The Luftwaffe responded in 3 phases. First, they increased approach speeds, diving at maximum velocity to reduce exposure time. Second, they shifted attack angles, coming from the high 6 o'clock position where gravity aided their pullout. Third, they began targeting specific aircraft with aggressive gunners, hoping to eliminate the threat before it spread. None of these adjustments solved the underlying problem. Faster approaches reduced shooting accuracy. Steeper dive angles made tracking targets even harder. Trying to single out aggressive gunners required identifying them in advance, which was nearly impossible amid the chaos of a running air battle. The 379th Bombardment Group flew 11 missions between August 26 and September 5. Arooth took part in 4 of them, adding 2 more confirmed kills to his record. Other tail gunners in the group claimed 7 additional victories. The Luftwaffe's loss rate against the Triangle K bombers continued to rise. German fighter commanders attempted a new tactic by concentrating their attacks. Instead of spreading interceptors along the entire bomber stream, they focused on individual groups, hoping sheer numbers would overwhelm defensive fire. The approach worked on September 3, when concentrated attacks against the 100th Bombardment Group destroyed 8 aircraft in 15 minutes. The 379th avoided that disaster by flying in a different position within the combat box, but the lesson was unmistakable. The Luftwaffe was adapting, searching for weaknesses in the new defensive methods. The air war over Europe had become a contest of tactical innovation. Each side studied the other's methods and developed countermeasures. Arooth understood what was at stake. His technique worked because it caught the enemy by surprise. Once the Germans developed effective counters, the advantage would vanish. Every mission became a test, every engagement a data point both sides would analyze. The temporary edge provided by aggressive fire was fading with each passing week. The mission scheduled for September 6 would strike Stuttgart deep in southern Germany. The route would carry the bombers more than 500 miles over enemy territory. It was the deepest penetration the 8th Air Force had attempted that month. Intelligence predicted heavy fighter opposition from bases in France, Belgium, and Germany itself. Stuttgart produced ball bearings, components essential to every vehicle, aircraft, and weapon in the German arsenal. Its strategic value made it one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Flak batteries ringed the city. Fighter squadrons were positioned along every likely approach. The briefing on September 5 outlined the challenge. The 379th would fly in the lead position of the combat wing. They would handle navigation and bomb, aiming for the formations behind them. Lead position meant absorbing the first fighter attacks. It meant flying straight and level while other groups maneuvered. It meant maximum exposure to everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. That evening, Arooth inspected his guns. Both Brownings had been freshly serviced. The feed mechanisms were smooth. The barrels had been replaced after excessive use. He loaded 1,200 rounds instead of the standard 800. The added weight mattered less to him than firepower. Tomorrow would test everything he had learned. Tomorrow would decide whether his methods could survive the most dangerous mission of his career. The Stuttgart mission launched at 5:40 a.m. on September 6. 187 bombers climbed into an overcast English sky. They formed over the North Sea before turning southeast toward occupied Europe. Tondelayo flew in the lead element of the 379th formation. Its position meant Arooth would face the first attacks from any direction. The fighters found them over France at 9:15 a.m. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rose from airfields across the region. They climbed to intercept the bomber stream before it reached German airspace. The first attacks came from the 11 o'clock position. These were head-on passes that challenged the nose gunners, not the tail. Arooth waited, watching contrails multiply behind the formation. The Luftwaffe was building strength. Fighters from multiple units were assembling into a concentrated force. By 9:40 a.m., intelligence estimated more than 100 interceptors shadowing the bombers. The rear attacks began at 10:08 a.m. A staffel of 12 Bf-109s positioned themselves 2,000 feet below the formation. They pulled up into a climbing attack from the 6 o'clock low position. Arooth opened fire at 700 yards, sending tracers into the lead fighters. 2 aircraft broke off immediately. A third absorbed multiple hits and fell away trailing smoke. The remaining 9 pressed their attack. Cannon shells tore through the formation. Bombers throughout the 379th Combat Box took hits. The B-17 off Tondelayo's left wing was struck in its number 3 engine. Another bomber in the low squadron began trailing fuel from ruptured tanks. Arooth kept firing. He shifted from target to target as fighters flashed through his field of view. His ammunition counter dropped steadily. 600 rounds, 500, 400. The attacks showed no sign of easing. At 10:31 a.m., a Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tondelayo from directly above and behind. The pilot used the sun to hide the approach. Arooth spotted the fighter too late. 20mm shells punched through the tail before he could bring his guns to bear. The impacts hurled him against the plexiglass. His left gun was destroyed. The receiver shattered under a direct hit. Fragments ripped through his flight suit, opening wounds across his arms and scalp. Blood streamed down his face, partially blinding him. He kept firing with the right gun. The Focke-Wulf pulled up and rolled away, trailing smoke from the hits it had taken. Arooth wiped blood from his eyes and searched for the next attacker. Tondelayo was dying. Cannon fire had severed hydraulic lines. The tail controls were damaged. Fuel tanks in the wing roots had been punctured. The pilots fought to hold altitude. The bomber was losing its struggle against gravity and damaged aerodynamics. The formation reached Stuttgart at 11:04 a.m. Tondelayo stayed in position long enough to release its bombs. Then it dropped out of formation as the damage overwhelmed the crew's ability to compensate. 2 engines were running rough. Fuel levels were critical. Over eastern France, the pilots made the decision. Tondelayo could not reach England. The best option was a controlled ditching in the English Channel. Air-sea rescue units might reach them before hypothermia set in. Arooth stayed at his position as the bomber descended. He watched for fighters that might finish off the crippled aircraft. None appeared. The Luftwaffe focused on healthier bombers still flying in formation. Tondelayo struck the channel at 3:12 p.m. The aircraft hit the grey water at 120 miles per hour. The fuselage broke apart on impact. Arooth was thrown forward. His head struck the gun mount. Darkness followed. When he regained consciousness, he was floating in a life raft. British rescue boats were approaching. All 10 crew members survived the ditching. The bomber that had carried them through 17 missions rested on the bottom of the English Channel. The 379th commander immediately requested Arooth's mission reports. The Distinguished Service Cross Citation arrived on October 14, 1943. The second highest decoration the United States Army could award recognized Arooth's actions during the Kassel and Stuttgart missions. The citation highlighted his decision to continue firing while wounded. It credited his defensive fire with protecting the bomber during its most vulnerable moments. By late October, the 8th Air Force gunnery staff completed their analysis. The data covered 14 bomber groups across 3 months of combat. The conclusions challenged assumptions that had guided American air combat since 1942. Tail gunners who engaged targets beyond 500 yards showed significantly higher survival rates. Early fire disrupted enemy formations. German pilots were forced to maneuver defensively instead of establishing stable firing platforms. The ammunition cost was high. The trade favored aggressive engagement. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson, commander of 8th Bomber Command Operational Planning, personally reviewed the findings. The implications extended beyond individual aircraft. If coordinated early fire from multiple bombers could disrupt mass fighter attacks, the entire defensive doctrine would need revision. The official policy change arrived in November. New gunnery guidelines authorized tail gunners to engage targets at extended ranges when tactical conditions allowed. The language was cautious and bureaucratic. The meaning was unmistakable. The approach that had kept Arooth alive was now becoming official doctrine. Arooth never saw the policy fully take effect. Head injuries from the Stuttgart ditching proved more serious than first believed. After returning to flight status in late September, he flew 3 additional missions. Medical officers then grounded him permanently. Recurring headaches and vision problems made further combat duty impossible. His final tally stood at 17 confirmed kills. 4 additional probables remained unverified. The The total placed him among the highest-scoring bomber gunners in the 8th Air Force. Some records credited him with as many as 19 victories. Documentation inconsistencies made an exact count difficult. The Distinguished Flying Cross followed the Distinguished Service Cross. 2 air medals with oak leaf clusters recognized his cumulative achievements. The Purple Heart acknowledged his wounds. By the end of his combat career, Arooth held more decorations than most pilots. The 379th Bombardment Group continued flying for another 18 months. They fought through the winter of 1943. They flew during the invasion summer of 1944. They remained in action through the final campaigns of 1945. The tactics Arooth pioneered spread throughout 8th Bomber Command. Tail gunners across the 8th Air Force adopted variations of early engagement. The statistical impact appeared slowly. Bomber loss rates declined through 1944. Multiple factors contributed. Longer-range fighter escorts reduced exposure. Improved aircraft systems increased survivability. Defensive gunnery also played a role. The shift toward aggressive fire was part of that change. German fighter pilots noticed the difference. Interrogation reports from captured Luftwaffe aircrew mentioned increased danger from tail gunners. The easy kills of early bomber interceptions became harder to achieve. Some pilots shifted entirely to head-on attacks. They accepted higher closure speeds to avoid concentrated rear fire. Arooth returned to the United States in early 1944. The Army Air Forces assigned him to training duty. He passed his combat experience to new gunners preparing for overseas deployment. He spent the rest of the war teaching the methods that had kept him alive. The students who trained under him carried those techniques into combat. They used them over Germany. They used them over Japan. They used them in every theater where American bombers faced enemy fighters. What Arooth did after the war surprised those who knew him. Michael Arooth did not leave military service. He transferred to the newly formed United States Air Force in 1947. He served another 15 years. The man who survived the deadliest skies over Europe stayed in uniform until 1962. He retired at the rank of Master Sergeant. The choice puzzled some. Arooth had lived through more combat than most men experience in several lifetimes. He had been wounded twice. He had ditched in the English Channel. He had faced death more times than records could capture. Many veterans with similar experiences sought civilian life. Arooth saw it differently. The Air Force had given him purpose during the darkest years of the century. The skills he developed had saved lives, not just his own, the lives of his crews, the lives of gunners who learned from him. Walking away felt like abandoning something important. His post-war years were quiet. He married, he raised a family. He rarely spoke about the war. The medals stayed in a drawer. The memories stayed locked away. Like many veterans of his generation, Arooth believed some things could never be explained. Those who were not there could never fully understand. Elmer Bendiner, Tondelayo's navigator, chose a different path. He became a journalist and author. He eventually wrote a memoir titled The Fall of Fortresses. The book described the crew's experiences in detail. It preserved moments that might otherwise have vanished. Bendiner's account ensured Tondelayo and her crew were remembered. The 379th Bombardment Group held reunions for decades. Veterans gathered to remember friends who never returned. They shared stories their families had never heard. They honored the young men they once were. Arooth attended when his health allowed. He reconnected with survivors from those desperate months over Europe. The National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona received his remains on February 20, 1990. He had died 5 days earlier in St. Augustine, Florida. He was 70 years old. His headstone listed his rank, it listed his branch, it listed his war. It did not mention the 17 fighters he destroyed. It did not mention the crews he protected. It did not mention the doctrine he helped reshape. Military cemeteries are full of such understatement. The stones mark names and dates. They cannot capture the weight behind them. Arooth rests among thousands of other veterans. Each carried a story worth telling. The mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia preserves the history of bomber crews who flew from England. The 379th Bombardment Group records are archived there. They include mission reports documenting Arooth's combat actions. Researchers can trace the evolution of gunnery doctrine through those files. The B-17 tail gunner position no longer exists. The aircraft that carried men like Arooth into battle have mostly vanished. They remain only as museum pieces and memorials, but the principles he demonstrated endure. Aggressive action over passive defense. The courage to challenge doctrine that was getting men killed. Those ideas remain relevant. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please hit the like button. Every like helps this story reach more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We recover forgotten stories every single day. Stories of tail gunners who protected their crews with courage and innovation. Real people, real heroism. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community spans the world. You are not just watching, you are helping keep these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Let us know you are here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure Michael Arooth does not fade into silence. These men deserve remembrance. You are helping make that happen.